gentlemen, it's a privilege to welcome you all this evening on behalf of Legends of India. My name is Prof Bharat Gupt. As you know, Legends of India was formed in 1988 to promote Indian culture and art, which includes music, dance, theatre and fine arts, and to build knowledge and awareness among the members of the public and propagate the richness, the depth, the vitality and the beauty of Indian culture and its heritage and its traditional art forms. We've always strived to encourage the younger generation to be interested in these vital matters and encourage young talents. Today's and this Pendulum series of discussions is a part of trying to create that awareness and encourage younger people to be interested in this topic. And I'm very grateful to Shanta ji, Mrs. Shanta Serbjeet Singh, who's agreed to curate this for Legends of India. She, as you know, is the Vice Chairperson of the Sangeet Natak Academy and the Chairperson of APAN, which is the Asia Pacific Performing Arts Network. There is a lot, she really needs no introduction. She's probably India's best known doyen and writer on art and culture. We are also very privileged to have a very distinguished panel of speakers this evening, beginning with Mr. Prem Shankar. What can I say about Mr. Jha? He's a veteran newspaper editor, and there is no big name newspaper, including the Hindustan Times, Times of India, Economic Times, Financial Express, where he has held editorial positions. He's written a dozen books covering social, economic, political, as well as cultural issues. And he's been an advisor to the Prime Minister as well in the past. He's a visiting faculty at the Harvard University. I can go on and on, but I guess you know it all anyway. We also have with us Professor Bharat Gupt, Professor Bharat Gupt is a retired associate professor of English who's taught at the College of Vocational Studies, but that's only part of it. He's a renowned Indian classicist and a theatre theorist. Is a Surbahar, very accomplished Surbahar player himself, and a cultural analyst, newspaper columnist, and is a visiting faculty at the National School of Drama. He speaks Sanskrit, Hindi, English, and Greek. So he writes for a lot of research journals, newspapers, cultural, and he's also a very vocal activist to promote revival of culture and Indian heritage through the educational system. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Shanta ji, for taking this up, and on our behalf, I would request you to take on the proceedings from me.
Thank you so much, Arun. I am so much linked with culture that I thought that in doing Pendulum dialogues, I will look at issues which are not strictly art and culture, but which provoke the kind of debate that a cultural paradigm should have. Should take this whole matter of art and culture and song and dance to another plane where Legends of India could make a contribution by inviting speakers, thinkers, planners for the country's good, who know what quote-unquote culture is all about, but who haven't had a chance to be, to share their thoughts about it in their different micro-disciplines. So, this is a forum for that. And we value interaction, we value dissenting points of view, we value the kind of perspectives on culture which will give a broader meaning to it. I personally, if there is time at the end of this time, would like to come in and share my thinking on what is unique about culture. It is both unifying to me and divisive. So first we'd like to know from our eminent speakers what is their take on this subject and how seriously do they think that it can unite, and how seriously it can divide, which of course both of them are possible, but I'll reserve my comment on this to a little later stage. So I now call on Prem to kindly elucidate his thing. Between you two, Jay.
Should we toss a coin? Anyone got a coin?
Days of coins are gone.
Now he has me at a disadvantage. He can let me have
That's
it.
a bit difficult.
You'll have an opportunity to rejoin. So you got to
The rejoinders are always weak, you know. Acha, anyway, thank you, Shanta, for calling me Shanta. It's a subject that's very close to my heart, but very far from my writings. All my writings have been on basically political economy, a little bit of history. But culture has really been very deep involvement with music, to a lesser extent dances, which was kept me alive through a series of crises in my life. And this subject is really fit for a pendulum dialogue, because in fact, the more I think of culture, the more I see that it can unite, but it also divides. And I think before one sees how this happens, I think it's really important to talk a little bit more about this word itself. I find culture an unsatisfactory word because it takes in too much. It's sort of whatever it's called, it's an all-embracing word. So I'll try and disaggregate it a little bit, what I have to say. And where does culture divide, and where does it unite? And is there anything we can do in looking at the two side by side? Any lessons we can learn which can reduce the divisiveness and increase the assimilativeness of culture? I'll give you one example which, in a sense, sticks in my mind. It's one of several, but this one really sticks in my mind. Many years ago, of both actually, it's an interesting episode which actually tells you both the elements in one. Many years ago, Zubin Mehta was appointed the resident conductor of the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra. And he went to Jerusalem, and it's a wonderful orchestra. He was truly happy, particularly because he had a really nasty time in New York as the conductor of the New York Philharmonic. There had been a relentless campaign to get him out at any pretext. So when he went to Israel, he found a whole different culture there, a musical culture, and settled out very happily. But he had one thing: he wanted to play Wagner, and for Jews, particularly Jews who went through the Holocaust, Wagner had the most terrible associations. Yet he talked to the orchestra. I think the orchestra felt the same way. And so eventually, they finally decided, I think this was 7 or 9 months after he had taken over, that they would perform Wagner in Israel. The very first time, and this must have been sometime in the 90s, the early 90s it was. So the hall was full, the word had spread. In any case, for classical music halls were usually full in Jerusalem anyway. And they played Wagner. And there was a gentleman sitting in one of the front rows. After the music was over, he got up, and as Zubin Mehta was taking his bows, and to fulsome applause, the gentleman walked up to him very quietly, raised his stick and brought it down very hard on Zubin Mehta's wrist and broke it. That sums up both sides to me of this cultural culture at its highest levels, whether it's music or dance, poetry, literature, is syncretic by definition because it deals with the human condition. And it forces you to remember that in the end we are all human. But culture also, the same word refers to the entire background of unspoken assumptions, undigested, sometimes wrongly digested, often pre-digested notions and ideas that you get from your parents, you get from society around you, you get from the prejudices of your friends, or sometimes the wisdom of your friends. It all adds up, and what it does is it creates a worldview, a sort of a frame through which you look at the world. That's your value frame within which you work. You'll question, you will analyze everything within that frame. But the frame itself, you don't question. And that too is a product of culture. Now, in this particular case, you saw 100, incidentally, the people who went out to Zubin Mehta when he was in the New York Philharmonic were all New York Jews from the orchestra, most of them. He was in the homeland of the Jews, and they played Wagner, and he talked about it to the orchestra, and the orchestra said, "We want to play Wagner." Wagner used to be played when I'm sure many of you know, when they were taking the Jews to the gas chambers. So that is the extent to which he had been able to trigger syncretism. He himself was from India. He's from a country which had never had a tradition, an anti-Semite tradition, anti-Jewish tradition. He himself is a Parsi minority. It was perfect. It was a perfect example of syncretism. But that poor man had seen the other side of culture. And he lived with death year after year, wondering when it was going to finally come and claim him. And he escaped. And he could not get over it. It's as simple as that. You find this happening here. Let's take an example from home. Right here. Middle class Muslim families find it surprisingly hard to find to rent apartments in Delhi, or for that matter in a very large number of northern cities. I can't speak for the south, and I don't think it's so like the extent there, or for that matter in the east. But Delhi is India, you know. And they jump to the conclusion, where some of them, since I have had very frank interactions. One time I remember in a conversation, someone saying they didn't get an apartment here. And another friend saying, was it because they were Muslims? And I explained to both of them, I was speaking to who were in fact Muslims, that no, don't jump to that conclusion. One of the simplest problems here is that the vast majority of Hindu families are vegetarian. And the idea of meat coming into the house, and more important, meat being cooked with onions and the aroma wafting through the house, is completely insufferable. First, the garlic is insufferable. You know, in Sattvic Bhojan, in Brahmanical food in India, garlic was forbidden. My grandfather's husband never ate garlic. Onions, Moraji Desai, my God, couldn't get him close to it, to onions or anything that was grown underground. That's not underground. Anyway, so the thing is, I had to explain that, and then I could see the change in when they realized that it was a cultural thing. going much deeper, and actually that the remedy to this is acceptance, understanding and acceptance, and not grievance. I think that, to me, the most wonderful thing about Indian culture at the high level, at the highest level, is that it is the only aesthetic system in the world which has actually codified syncretism in the performing arts. No other country has it. No other system of aesthetic, certainly not the Western, which divides and concretizes traditions. There are Western music and ballet and art, dance and music, certainly. The audience performer divide is total. It is symbolized by the fact that, actually, strictly speaking, only now breaking down, that the orchestra would be wearing black tie and tails. The audience was expected to be dressed well. You were absolutely silent. You couldn't even move around. One time I was listening to the fourth movement of Mahler, and my head was going slightly like this in a hall in New York, and the gentleman should back at me. I mean, it must have been moving about this much, but it was disturbing his concentration. You know, that we don't. In our case, it's the opposite. The audience and the musician or the dancer become part of each other. The whole idea is to avoid, is to abolish that separation. The same is true of the separations between music, dance, literature, and poetry. All of them are part of a single tradition of dance drama. There's nothing like it. Look at the idea, the raga structure. It universalizes music. So I think that we have things we have way beyond in our aesthetic development, in this syncretism, any other culture in the world. And I think that that's something we should remember. I'm proud we have it. We also have a very strong syncretic tradition in religion, which we are unfortunately losing. And to me, the one, I have very few problems with the BJP for example, as a governing system, governing party. In fact, when they were in power, they did very well. But I have tremendous problems with the cultural underpinnings of their thoughts and their policies. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Basically, that's a wonderful example of Zurumeta. And yes, about variance, symphony would definitely evoke, even in a person who is outside that framework, this kind of a moment of what went with it. But to actually pick up your stick and break the poor conductor's wrist is the kind of reaction which, luckily, we do not accept. Not because we call ourselves civilized, but because our culture, as you said rightly, is so very syncretic. Right now in Bharatanatyam, some of our best dancers who are being trained by a transgender Bharatanatyam dancer are all transgender, in a form which is so, focused on aesthetics, on beauty, on the female form, to bring in these transgender artists and for society to accept them. I think that is the kind of cultural model that we could be looking at. I'd like to request Professor Bharat Gupt now to give us his views on where we are.
Thank you, Shanta ji. Thank you, sir. I'm not going to rebut you. I'm going to say something which perhaps will rebut most ideas about what is culture and how culture has been looked upon and defined. You see, if you look at Indian languages, I don't think any Indian language beginning with Sanskrit has a word for culture. अगर कोई हो तो बता दीजिए मुझे. There is none. Because all the words like Sanskriti, which we are using day in and day out, is a neologism. It's a word which has come into existence in last 140, 50 years or something like that. Bhartendu Harishchandra maybe used it for the first time. And nobody who writes, very few people do write, but nobody who writes a Sanskrit today would use the word culture for Sanskriti, you see. If you look for ancient Greek, there is no word for culture. The whole concept of culture, as we understand, begins with the European Renaissance. And to my mind, it is a purely colonial word. It is a word which defines first Europe, which came out of the clutches of Christianity, riding on the help or the clutches of the Greeks and the Roman texts, making an identity for themselves, and then looking upon the rest of the world, to which it brought first religion, from 14th, 15th century, Christianity, reclaimed the lands in the name of God. Then it brought civilization and culture to them. You see, we have to understand these things very carefully, because they somehow continue to live in our present day lives and create all kinds of confusion. If you don't understand your own history, then you are not able to find solution. She talked of transgender. Now, one of my favorite subjects which sometimes irritates my friends is that I have been writing and talking a lot about homosexuality and article and section 370 and all that. And you know what happened, the High Court upheld it and then wanted a revision, it wanted to strike it down, then the Supreme Court brought it back. Why? Because we were looking for a solution which does not belong to our history and civilization. In the whole Indian history, there is no debate about somebody having the third nature. It is as legitimate, perfect, natural as the first and the second gender. So, if anybody had gone to court saying that, look, these are something like 35 texts, including the much maligned Manusmriti, which say that homosexuality is perfectly natural, created by God, then I'm sure the High Court and the Supreme Court would have had to take some cognizance. I have been through the whole of the orders and the court proceedings and everything. Nobody even mentioned it. When I tried to contact NAS Foundation and said, "Aap ye arguments to rakh ke dekho apne revision mein," that lady paid no attention. Because you are looking at a definition of what is culture. And therefore, sir, you are looking for syncretism. Because you look for syncretism only where you have divided. If you have not brought something to pieces, then there is no need for you to bring it back. This is not to say that the Greeks never thought of others as barbarous. They used to call them barbaroi, which we translate as uncultured. See? Or the ancient Hindus did not think of those who lived very far as vratyas. That is, not having the same vratas or systems of or values of life like onion, etc. But then that is not culture. You see, as you mentioned, that is a certain incompatibility which is more born out of habit. The example you gave about Zubin Mehta, I had a similar experience. Once I visited somebody in the United States, an old-time friend, and she said, I want to take you out to a film, and the film was Schindler's List. This is a long time back, 20 years ago. And I said, please, I've seen so many of them. Now this was a Jewish woman, a Canadian Jewish girl. And when she heard me saying that I have seen so many and I am sick of seeing these films, she just took back her invitation. She said, we are not going to any film. She was offended. Now, the fault was mine because I should have been sensitive to the fact that here is a Jewish woman, and I had known her for years, whose father had come out of a concentration camp. And to say that, oh, enough is enough, Jews have been crying about Holocaust for a long time, it was simply uncultured or insensitive or not very friendly on my part. And I think similarly, when we make this an issue that I'm going to play Wagner somewhere here, or if I'm going to publish a book on Hinduism by Wendy Doniger saying that Veda is a very horsey book, and then make that a big title, then these are not really cultural issues. These are only issues of bringing in friction on very small matters. And marketing, of course. That lady has made thousands of dollars, and she refused to debate her book with me in the Asian conference when we had made a panel 6 months in advance and given her notice. And now, maybe right now, she is giving a lecture to the association in the morning in New York as to how the Indians are persecuting her. Now, this is pure politics. Things, if I want to take you back to what was culture, let's say, in the ancient Indian world, which is now unfortunately classified for the reasons of the modern secular state, it is classified now as the Hindu world. You see, that's again a political denomination now. What you find there is that those things which improved the status of your consciousness, they were what we may today call culture, things like music, like dance, because music is going to take you to a higher level of consciousness, to the level of rasa, and then to the level of moksha, or whatever, a higher level. Similarly, something which is beautiful, or something which is totally engrossing, like the tragedy was for the Greeks, which is going to alter the state of your mind, the state of your thinking, and which is not going to bring a political benefit for you. You see, this is the most essential difference between modern cultures and classical cultures. That classical cultures, when they were, or civilizations, I don't like to use the word culture, when classical civilizations were indulging in what we call art or philosophy, they were purposely keeping politics out. In all the famous Greek temples, their enemies, Persians, were allowed entrance. They came to worship. The Greeks who attacked us and then who made the Bactrian Empire, they raised the Garuda pillar to Vishnu as far as Vidisha. So, when you had your politics, you went into war, you conquered a kingdom, but when it was time for you to worship, then you could be both Vaishnavas. And it was very clear that the purpose of so-called culture would be different. and the purpose of politics will be different. Now, it is with the rise of the European civilization in the 14th century that you have a combination of politics and culture. So first of all, Europe creates this whole myth about Alexander, ecumenia, that he started from Macedonia and then he went right up to India and he conquered and he made civilized everybody, and that was ecumenical. He was bringing people together, it was syncretism, whereas actually it was nothing but plunder, burning, killing. If you just end up finally in making a city and a Greek amphitheater and all that, then you don't really give culture. You don't really give civilization. What you do give is subjugation. The story was repeated pretty much in the Muslim world, where religion and politics become one. Darul Harb and Darul Islam, these are the two distinctions, and every kind of theology, every kind of culture is essentially wedded to that. Now, it's a historical fact that these were not the values of the Greek world, these were not the values of the Indian world. I was about to say that I don't know enough about China and I was about to ask your opinion, but my guess was that the Chinese also did not have. When did the Chinese become enemies of India? After they became Marxists. Before that, they came to study here. They never thought of attacking us. And the great Chinese emperor used to import women and queens from India because they thought that they would give them great progeny and beauty and all that. Then music was a big import from India all the time into China. And they had no political conflict. The only Indian ruler who thought of conquering China was Muhammad bin Tughlaq, I think. He had Muhammad bin Tughlaq. So, no, Muhammad bin Tughlaq thought of invading China. He made a plan. Yeah, Tariq al-Firoz Shahi has mentioned that. Now, unless we come to this distinction, I am not asking for a return or a go back to the Hindu times or the pre-Muslim times. I am only asking for a cultural, analytical, historical study of values. Why did these people not really make it a condition that arts will be promoting the state? You see, the conflict which you mentioned, for instance, Israel is a state which comes into existence, and Zubin Mehta is brought in here in order to elevate the idea of modern Israel. And therefore Wagner comes into conflict for the very simple reason that you have a history here. So, it is these kinds of conflict, when they are essentially marketed as cultural conflicts, whereas they are actually political conflicts. And we should be able to understand that. When I went to college and Professor Muhammad Amin taught me history in first year, he said that, there was this book published from Kitab Mahal, Balli Maran, and the book says that Muhammad Ghazni had to invade India because he was short of money, and so he destroyed the Indian temples, the Hindu temples, and you find this kind of thought being repeated ad nauseum. Wendy Doniger says the same thing in Hindus and Alternate History. If you read my review, I have given the quotes. Now, what these people are doing is really selling a political apology. This is no logic that if I need money, then I come and break your temples. You see, this is certainly not an apology. the loot and plunder is plain and simple loot and plunder. It cannot be considered